I'm Faizan, Member of Youth Parliament for Redbridge, and without further ado, I'm going to introduce our next co-host who shall be speaking. This is an organisation called EnCaf Youth, who are an umbrella group that has homed over 80 organisations and is based in Enfield and is one of the strongest boroughs. Yeah, one of the strongest boroughs in climate activity. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our guest from EnCaf Youth.
Hello, thank you. My name is Monica, and I am from EnCaf Youth, along with Olivia, Anna, and James. And today we have 4 pledges, and I'm going to be taking the first pledge, which is about incinerators. So our first pledge is the government should not construct any more incinerators and should cease to use them by 2030 to align with the IPCC's targets for carbon neutrality. So to expand on to this point, incinerators produce a wide variety of pollutants which affect human health, causing health risks such as lung cancer and asthma attacks, which is why the government should not construct any more incinerators. Moving on to our second pledge, the government should create a criteria for industrial areas and have periodic reviewings to consider if there's still industrial areas. So as you can see the little diagram on screen right now, I'm just going to expand on that a little bit more. So if the government have reviewed the industrial area and it is still classed industrial, then no further action should be taken. However, we encourage the removal of the incinerator in accordance with the first sub-pledge. If it is not classed industrial, then there shall be a removal of incinerators and the incinerator building to be repurposed, if possible, into something like a recycling centre. And in this event, the incinerator has to stay, and the council must make the incinerator as environmentally friendly as possible. So, for example, they could ensure that the waste is sorted to prevent the burning of recyclable waste. Moving on to the third pledge, the government should consider population density when maintaining or building incinerators. So this will decrease the risk posed by emissions from incinerators to the public's health. So this is a really important pledge because if the government are aware of the population, they're also aware of how close people are living near the incinerator, because this is a huge risk for people's health. And moving on to the last pledge for incinerators, the government should introduce an incinerator tax, which should be used to fund recycling schemes. So this will therefore increase waste to be recycled, creating no use for incinerators, which is our main aim in this pledge. And we're actually the only country in Europe that doesn't have an incinerator tax. So I believe if we did, it would be a huge deterrent for having to even use incinerators in the first place. Thank you, they're all my pledges. I'm now going to move on to the next speaker, who I believe is James.
Hi everybody. So I'll be talking about our second pledge, which is legal accountability and environmental justice. So as you can see from the screen, we've divided this into 3 sub-pledges. So firstly, we're going to deal with the international pledge. So we would like to see more legal accountability for states who fail to reach their emissions targets. Now, these targets can be both those set out in international agreements and also domestic targets set by individual countries. And we could help achieve this by better utilising existing environmental courts and tribunals, which are not currently being used effectively. Now, these courts are actually already in place by the UN's environmental programme, which is called UNEP. However, we would like to see a greater use of these and an overall raising of legal accountability, because it's essential that states are held to account for failures in meeting their targets, because otherwise what will happen is states can just get away with making empty promises and overall nothing substantially positive is done for the environment. So as such, our international sub-pledge would be, we'd like to see a commitment to full state accountability in relation to emissions targets. Now for our domestic sub-pledges. So firstly, we'd like to see the government put in place a statutory provision to protect against environmental discrimination. And they could do this by making use of the protected characteristics which are already set out in the Equality Act 2010. And these protected characteristics cannot be infringed upon in a discriminatory way. So to put this into context, an example of environmental discrimination could be seen in the fact that more deprived areas are usually the target locations for things such as incinerators. Ultimately, this is completely unequal and unjust. Therefore, a statutory provision would allow individuals to hold those who have made these decisions to be held to account by way of the law and essentially seek remedy. If we are to achieve environmental justice in the UK, something we have not really seen at all, then we must outlaw environmental injustice on a national scale. So our final sub-pledge on the domestic level is following on from that, which is that we want to see significant improvement to access to environmental justice, particularly considering it disproportionately affects marginalized communities, as I've already mentioned. Access to environmental justice means that those who are subjected to discriminatory decisions in an environmental context are able to seek justice and resolution through the courts. Now, this is crucial, as if access to environmental justice is low, then ultimately it allows for a continuous cycle of unjust decision-making, and those who are subject to this unjust decision-making are simply trapped within that cycle and cannot seek remedy, whether that be legally. So that's all of the pledges for legal accountability and environmental justice, and I really do hope you would vote for these, because we must firstly hold the states to account for their emissions targets, which was our first sub-pledge. We must secondly outlaw environmental discrimination, and we must thirdly improve access to environmental justice. Thank you. So I'm now going to move on to the third speaker. Thank you for listening.
So I'll be talking about equity on the global stage, and this is our pledge, and it's split into 3 sub-pledges here. And so first, we'd like the government to stop offsetting their emissions to developing countries. So I'll explain offsetting a bit, which is the reduction of emissions or greenhouse gases in order to compensate for emissions made elsewhere. And the reason that governments offsetting to developing countries are quite problematic is because normally it takes the form of trees, and trees take a long time to grow, and sometimes later on in their life they are cut down through deforestation. And as you can see, if we did have trees as a way to offset our emissions, it wouldn't actually really be sustainable or achieve the offsetting. What we'd actually like to see is a reduction in emissions. So that's why we'd like the government to stop offsetting to developing countries. And just adding on from that, it's quite cheap to offset our emissions to the global south, and that disproportionately affects them, especially indigenous people's rights. They might be forced out of their homes in order to make room for these trees that are being planted. And also links to climate colonialism, where less powerful nations and peoples are often dominated by the more richer, more powerful ones through initiatives that are meant to kind of slow down the pace of climate breakdown. So that way it would be unfair. So that's why we'd like the government to stop offsetting their emissions to developing countries. Our second sub-pledge is that emissions should be counted in the total emissions from the country. So what we mean by that is we can use the example of recycling. So quite a lot of our recycling is sent to other countries such as Malaysia, Turkey, and Poland, because they've got the facilities to recycle our waste. And a lot of the time, especially in Malaysia, the waste that we send there is often burnt instead of recycled. And in order for equity and fairness with climate change, we're asking that for example, the waste sent to Malaysia that is then burnt, it produces emissions. And because the UK is the origin source of those emissions, the UK has to count those emissions as their own rather than Malaysia's. So that way it could be fair when looking at which countries are polluting the most, because a lot of this time it gets muddled up who's actually responsible for what emissions. And then the third sub-pledge is ring fencing an environmental aid budget. So by ring fence, we mean that the government has to guarantee that the funds they're setting aside for environmental aid, for example, in this scenario, it has to be spent on environmental aid. We don't want to see it coming out from other budgets or just not being fully delivered. We want environmental aid to be fully given and delivered in its full amount. So that's what we mean by ring fence. And the reason that it's necessary to have an environmental aid budget, because if we are going to reach our global targets and reduce our global emissions, then we need to see sustainable development, and we need to see sustainable initiatives built up. So if we are sending aid to other countries, it should be in the form of sustainable, to see sustainable development over there. So yeah, these are our 3 sub-pledges on equity on the global stage, and I'll be passing it over to Anna, who's going to talk on recycling now.
Okay, thank you. So our last pledge is waste and recycling, and there's like 5 sub-pledges for this. So the first one is compulsory education for all school children in primary and secondary schools on recycling. We believe this is really important, that we have to target younger people because they'll be the ones influencing their friends, their parents, and that's how change will happen. Our second sub-pledge is compulsory for businesses to recycle and compost waste. Now, some small businesses are unable to afford recycling, especially during these times. So it's important that there's a way in which these businesses will be able to afford this. So for example, government subsidies, that could be perhaps an idea. Our third pledge is incinerators must sort recycling and ensure minimal amount of recyclable waste is burnt. Now, we've done our research and more than 50% of the waste incinerated is actually not recyclable. It is recyclable, and if it was sorted, then we would be able to use more sustainable. Then our fourth sub-pledge is government should discourage supermarkets in using unnecessary plastic packaging and promote plastic-free supermarkets nationwide. What this means is essentially that if the government promotes supermarkets that promote plastic-free products, then these supermarkets will be more motivated to keep going and also influence other supermarkets, and they will not want to stay behind, so they will join with them as well. And for example, unnecessary plastic packaging can be packaging fruits that, for example, might not be necessarily need to be packaged with plastic. And then our fifth sub-pledge is governments to ban the waste of unsold food produced by supermarkets and food outlets. Actually, in France, it's illegal to throw away food that is unsold. So what they do is they collect it all, and what they do is they pass it on to shelters, homeless people, and the poor as well. So those are our 5 sub-pledges for waste and recycling. It's really important that we target young people for this because that's where the conversation will continue. So it's really important. Thank you.